Have you ever wondered why you seem to be going around in circles, even when you do everything right? Why do some people move forward with almost instinctive force, while you hesitate, start over, sabotage yourself? The answer may hurt, but pain, as we well know, is a symptom, and every symptom holds a hidden truth. Today, I want to show you that your speed of growth does not depend solely on the effort you put in, the books you read, or the courses you take. It depends, first and foremost, on the image you have of yourself when no one is looking. Yes, I'm talking about your self-esteem, but not in the fragile, motivational sense that has become popular. No, I'm talking about self-esteem as an expression of your unconscious, as a direct result of what you learned to feel about yourself in the early years of your life. Your haste, your paralysis, your anger, even your ambition. These are just side effects of the relationship you have with your own worth. You see, most people don't grow slowly because they lack talent. They grow slowly because they unconsciously believe they don't deserve to get there. They create bold goals with their ego, but the superego, that critical voice inherited from childhood, whispers in their ear, "You're not good enough." And the ID, which carries the most primitive impulses, responds with sabotage, procrastination, and excessive immediate gratification. It's not a lack of strength, it's an internal conflict, an invisible tug of war between what you want, what you fear, and what you believe is allowed for someone like you. Perhaps you learned at a very young age that love only came after obedience, that attention was a reward, not a right, that making mistakes was dangerous, and that standing out was too risky. Children absorb messages like they breathe. They don't interpret them, they embody them. And if you grew up in an environment where love was conditional, where mistakes were punished with silence or humiliation, where comparison was a form of encouragement, then it's likely that you still live under that invisible court today. A name for this, I tell you, is the tyrannical superego. It doesn't just judge. It sabotages. It makes every attempt to grow accompanied by paralyzing fear or corrosive guilt. And the cruelest part is that you think the problem is you, but the problem is never you. The problem is the way you were taught to see yourself. And that, my friend, can be changed as long as you're willing to look where it hurts. Your self-esteem is not a superficial belief. It is a deep structure, shaped by years of unconscious repetition. Every time someone compared you, ignored you, or cut you down, a brick was added to that structure. And now, every time you try to build something new, you bump into those old foundations. That's why it's so hard to stay consistent. Because part of you, the part that learned you're not good enough, is still afraid of succeeding. Succeeding would be an affront to the emotional logic of childhood. Being successful would be disobeying the script you were given. And the unconscious, hates disruption. Your slowness, your anxiety, your feeling that it's never enough. These are symptoms. And like all symptoms, they are coded messages. When someone tells me they're stuck, that they can't grow despite trying, I listen to the symptom with reverence. Because they're saying, I'm still stuck with an image that isn't mine. That image of failure, inadequacy, insufficiency was stuck to you when you were too vulnerable to question it. But now you can, and you must, because real growth requires, before any technique or strategy, a symbolic break with the past. To grow is to say, I am no longer that child who needed to be perfect to be loved. But be careful. The unconscious cannot be convinced with words. It requires experience, consistency, symbolic repetition. That's why every time you respect yourself, even when you feel afraid, every time you say no, even when you want to please, every time you prioritize your peace, even knowing that you will be judged, you are rewriting your internal story. You are teaching your unconscious. that you no longer need to sabotage yourself to keep others' love, that you can be yourself, whole, imperfect, desiring, and still be worthy of growing, achieving, shining. And you may ask, but Freud, how can I do that if guilt dominates me? If fear sabotages me? If I can't even believe I can do it? I say to you, start by not fighting the symptom, but by listening to it, guilt. It reveals where your loyalty is still tied to the past. Fear? It shows where you still feel small in the face of old ghosts. Procrastination? It is the unconscious protest against a goal that may not even be yours. Start there, listening, translating, making pain your compass, because the symptom, however uncomfortable it may be, is always an attempt by the psyche to protect itself. No one sabotages themselves for pleasure. They sabotage themselves out of loyalty to an old belief, out of fear of losing a conditional love, out of loyalty to a parent who never valued them. Pain is not the end. It is the beginning. It is the call. And that is why I invite you to continue with this analysis. Because behind your slowness, behind your doubt, there is a child who learned to diminish themselves in order to survive. But now, they no longer need that. Now they have you. An adult, conscious, lucid, ready to grow not out of haste, but out of truth. Have you ever noticed how uncomfortable it is to praise yourself out loud? How strange it feels to look in the mirror and say with conviction, I am enough. This is no accident. This is emotional memory. Because for many, praising oneself is like breaking a silent pact with pain. It is like betraying that inner child who got used to only receiving love when they blamed themselves, when they corrected themselves, when they nullified themselves. And this is where we begin to touch the most sensitive core of self-esteem. It is not built with positive phrases stuck on the refrigerator. It is rebuilt with the psychological courage to unlearn shame. Shame, that viscous emotion that paralyzes us in the face of growth, is a protective mechanism. Yes, protection. Because for a child, rejection is equivalent to psychological death. So they learn to hide, to mold themselves, to erase themselves. They grow up believing that they will only be accepted if they are flawless. The problem is that when they become adults, they continue trying to please an inner world that still functions under the commands of that parental superego, that voice that never praises, that only points out flaws, that says, you are only worth something. If. And so, the person becomes an adult in body, but remains childish in their psyche. They act like someone who is free, but live imprisoned by an inherited voice. Maybe you're right there, stuck between the desire to grow up and the fear of no longer being loved if you change, between the desire to be authentic and the panic of being rejected for it. This tension is the conflict between the ID, which wants to be whole, and the superego, which demands perfection in order to grant love. The ego, poor thing, is caught in the middle, trying to reconcile desire and morality, impulse and guilt. And when this conflict becomes unbearable, the ego becomes ill. Symptoms appear: anxiety, procrastination, self-sabotage, a feeling of always falling short. But what is a symptom if not a failed attempt to resolve an internal conflict? I want you to start observing your symptoms with loving curiosity. Every time you feel paralyzed, ask yourself, who am I obeying inside myself? When you feel guilty for resting, ask, who told me that I only deserve value if I'm exhausted? These inner voices are not yours. They were installed as mental programs during childhood, and they continue to operate on autopilot unless you consciously confront them. And here's the crucial point. You can only grow at the speed of your self-love. Because without love for yourself, success becomes punishment. Growth becomes punishment. And without knowing it, you will do everything to get back to where you started. Where? At least the suffering was familiar. The unconscious prefers the known to pleasure. It seeks repetition, not fulfillment. That's why, even when everything goes right, you may feel that something is wrong. As if it weren't fair, as if it weren't yours. This is the return of the repressed. It's the trauma saying, you still believe you don't deserve it. And then, out of loyalty to the suffering that shaped you, you sabotage yourself. You delay. You complicate things. And you still say, that's just how I am. But you're not. You are. You are still entangled in the old webs of your emotional makeup. And only analysis, that slow, deep, sometimes painful process, can help you untangle those internal knots. Have you noticed how people with low self-esteem live in search of external validation? How they need others to say, you're good. You deserve it. You can do it. This isn't just neediness, it's symbolic dependence. It's the inner child still waiting for the applause that never came. But what no one tells you is that when that applause arrives too late, it no longer heals. Because the only applause that truly transforms is the applause you learn to give yourself. Yes, the real turning point comes when you become your own parent, when you embrace your flaws like a wise father, when you celebrate your progress like a loving mother. And that can't be learned through coaching. It's learned by facing your original pain. Do you want to truly grow? Then start by listening to what you fear most, because fear is a guardian of trauma. Where there is fear, there is a repressed emotional memory. And where there is repression, there is potential for healing. Yes, healing. But not that illusory healing of overcoming and forgetting. Freudian healing is different. It is making conscious what was unconscious. It is being able to say, now I understand why I repeat myself. Now I see where that voice that limits me came from. And in that moment, something inside you reorganizes itself. The ID stops fighting blindly. The superego loses strength. And the ego, for the first time, begins to rule with clarity. But this requires symbolic mourning. Mourning for the child who is not seen. For the pain you tried to minimize. For the versions of yourself you had to kill to please others. This mourning is necessary. Because as long as you avoid this pain, you are also preventing the birth of something new. Growing up is dying to old images of yourself. It is losing the right to be just a victim. And that, my friend, is scary. Because the victim is innocent, but the person who awakens becomes responsible. And being responsible for yourself is heavy. But it's the only way to be free. So I ask you now, with all the weight that this question carries, are you ready to stop sabotaging yourself? Are you ready to abandon the illusion that if you hide enough, no one will hurt you? Because, ironically, the more you hide, the more you get hurt. And the more you try to be perfect, the further you stray from what it means to be human. Growth has not come from perfection. It comes from the radical acceptance of your truth, of your story, of your pain. And if at that moment you feel like crying, don't hold it back. Crying is not weakness. It is a psychic release. It is the unconscious opening a breach. Allow yourself. Because the more you allow yourself to feel, the more you free yourself from the armor that binds you. And the more you free yourself, the more you grow not at the speed of the market, but at the speed of the soul. A speed that is yours unique. And therefore, sacred, there is a moment in therapy when the patient stops blaming the world and starts to really listen to themselves. That's when they say, with a trembling voice, I think it's me who won't let myself. And I know, at that moment, that the healing has begun. Because the most liberating, and at the same time most frightening, truth is this. We are the ones who unconsciously prevent our own growth. Not out of stupidity, not out of weakness, but out of loyalty to old pains. Growing up requires betraying the narrative of who you always thought you needed to be in order to be loved. And that, my friend, is a revolutionary act out after all. What? Is self-esteem, if not the internal permission to take up space? To desire without guilt? To exist without apologizing? But how can someone who learned early on that their value depended on the approval of others do this without falling apart inside? It's impossible. That's why you sabotage yourself even when you want to win. Because victory disrupts the internal system that was built for survival. Not fulfillment. Low self-esteem is actually a sophisticated defense mechanism created by the psyche to avoid facing the horror of discovering that the love you received was conditional. If you accept that you deserve it, you will have to deal with the fact that you were unfairly diminished. And that hurts so much that many prefer to continue punishing themselves rather than face this truth. The mind prefers to repeat familiar patterns than to open the wound. But it must be opened, not to bleed forever, but to let in the light of consciousness. Let me tell you a story. A promising young man, intelligent and full of ideas, was always late for important meetings, he said. He was distracted, that he needed to improve his organization. But as we dug deeper together, something else emerged. Whenever he approached an opportunity for recognition, he froze. And later, crying, he remembered. His father only paid attention to him when he made mistakes. Getting things right was ignored. Mistakes were an opportunity for contact, albeit painful. Thus, his unconscious mind learned that being seen was associated with failure. Growing up, therefore, was synonymous with abandonment. And that's why he was late. That's why he lost what he said he wanted. Because inside, being successful meant disappearing in his father's eyes. And who can sustain success if it triggers such ancient pain? This is where we understand. Self-esteem is not about liking yourself. It is about enduring who you are, even if it goes against everything you have learned to be accepted. It is having the courage to exist with power, even if it disappoints those who only knew how to love you when you were small. Yes, there is a price to pay for becoming whole, a high price, because there will be those who criticize you, who abandon you, who say that you've changed. But what those voices are really saying is, you are no longer useful to my needs, and you don't exist to be useful. You exist to be true. Now tell me, how many times have you diminished your ideas so as not to seem arrogant? How many times? Have you kept your opinion to yourself so as not to displease others? How many times have you pretended to be fine so as not to worry others? That is not humility. That is fear. And fear, when repeated in silence, becomes identity. The person no longer knows who they are, only who they have learned to be in order not to lose love. And so they live a life of emotional performance. They play the role of the good child, the discreet colleague, the present friend, while inside they scream. But the scream is muffled because the superego soon intervenes. You're exaggerating. Stop complaining. There are people worse off than you. And so the scream becomes a symptom. Anguish, discouragement, anger without cause. But there is a way out, and it begins with a symbolic gesture of disobedience. Choosing yourself, even if it seems selfish. Because, listen carefully, only those who choose themselves can choose others freely. Those who abandon themselves deep down only form relationships out of fear of being alone. And fear breeds dependence. Dependence drives others away. And so, the original pain of rejection is repeated. The only way to break this cycle is to rebuild your inner pact with your own value. This takes time, persistence, and above all, it requires truth. You don't have to pretend you're ready. You just have to admit that you're hurt. Because when the wounded speak, the unconscious listens. And as it listens, it begins to reorganize itself. And that's when transformation happens. Not with motivational phrases, but with the brutal courage to look inside and say, I am worthy. Even if you haven't been treated as such. Even if everything around you says otherwise. You are worthy because you exist. Because you feel. Because you desire. And desire, that vital impulse that comes from the ID, is proof that there is life pulsing inside you. But desire, poor thing, is so often censored. This is too much for me, you think. I'm not capable. It's not my profile. But who said that? Who taught you to doubt yourself so much? That voice, I assure you, is not yours. It was introjected, and now it echoes, as if it were true. But it's not. It's just repetition. And all repetition, once you become aware of it, can be broken. Are you ready to break free? To disappoint those who expected you to remain small, submissive, predictable? Because that's what growing up is all about. Frustrating. The expectations that have been projected onto you. And this frustration, paradoxically, is liberating. Because when you disappoint others, you stop disappointing yourself. And that, my friend, is the first step towards solid self-esteem, not the kind that depends on applause, but the kind that comes from the inner silence that says, I am here for me. Perhaps now you are beginning to realize that your self-esteem is not just in the words you repeat to yourself in front of the mirror. It is in the way you react when you fail, when you are ignored, when you don't get the recognition you expected. It is at that exact moment, when the world does not validate you, that your true self appears. Because self-esteem is not about feeling good when everything is going well. It is about continuing to stand tall when external reality offers no applause. And that, my friend, is psychological maturity. It is when the ego becomes strong enough not to depend on the approval of others to exist. But this doesn't happen overnight. The ego, as I have taught you, is a construct. It emerges as a mediator between the ID, our desires, and the superego, our moral demands. And when this ego is fragile, it bows too much to the superego. It becomes a slave to guilt, a self-censor. It lives to avoid criticism, to not make mistakes, to maintain an image. But living to maintain an image is not living. It is acting. And acting, day after day, generates a deep existential fatigue. You are tired not because you do too much, but because you have to pretend too much. And pretending that everything is fine when inside you there is a silent implosion is one of the most brutal forms of psychological self-harm. I need you to understand something. Your difficulty in growing up quickly is not laziness. It is self-defense. Growing up quickly requires exposure. It requires showing up. And showing up, for those who were hurt in childhood, is synonymous with danger. How many times have you been ridiculed for trying something new? How many times have you been compared to your sibling, colleague, or neighbor who did it better? This does not go unpunished. Every word of devaluation becomes a psychological sentence. And worse, you believe them, as if it were destiny. But it's not destiny. It's an unconscious script. And scripts can be rewritten. But to do that, you'll need to face the pain of abandoning your adapted version, the one that learned to sabotage itself just to stay within the limits of emotional visibility allowed in your family. Because, believe me, there are families in which the success of one child threatens the balance of the entire system. Growth arouses envy. Brilliance is uncomfortable. And children, sensitive as they are, notice this, and they begin to diminish themselves to maintain love. The name for this? Repression. Yes, repression, that central operation in psychoanalysis, is not just about sexual desire. It's about any impulse that threatens belonging. For many, growing up was unconsciously associated with exclusion. To abandonment, to the cold silence. of a father ashamed of his son's success, to the veiled competition of a resentful mother. And so today, with every step you try to take, your unconscious puts on the brakes. Don't go. Stay where it's safe. If you grow up, you'll lose love. But now you are an adult, and you need to tell your unconscious firmly, I no longer need anyone's permission to flourish. Because you are no longer in that house with those people, in that dynamic. But the psyche, you see, does not know that. For it, time does not pass. The unconscious is timeless. That's why we repeat ourselves. That's why even at 40 we act like children in certain situations. What you feel today is not weakness. It's memory. Emotional memory that screams when you try to break out of the pattern that kept you alive. And here's the beauty of analysis. It doesn't push you. It gives you back. It doesn't say, go faster. It asks, why did you stop? And that question, when truly heard, is liberating. Because when you understand why you stopped, you stop blaming yourself. And in place of blame comes compassion. And with compassion, change becomes possible. See. No one transforms their self-esteem by treating themselves with hatred, by punishing themselves, by demanding constant performance. Self-esteem is born from embracing your own history, from making peace with the past, and that takes time. But above all, it requires presence. You need to be present for yourself. Listen to your anxieties without judgment. Validate your fears without ridiculing them. Because the wounded child living inside you doesn't need a new inner critic. They need an ally, an adult who looks at them and says, I see you. And when that child feels seen, they calm down. And when they calm down, they allow the adult to act. And that's when life moves forward. That's when goals get off the ground. Not by force, but by internal permission. When you start treating yourself with dignity, the world reacts. Because the world doesn't treat us the way we want to be treated. It treats us the way we believe we deserve to be treated. And that's not mysticism. It's psychology. It's projection. You project your value onto others, and others reflect that back to you. When you put yourself down, others tend to see you that way. When you apologize for existing, others treat you like you're a nuisance. But when you assert yourself as a person, with desires, opinions, and presence, the playing field changes. And then, finally, you start to grow at the speed of truth. And maybe now you feel afraid. Afraid of losing people, opportunities, spaces that only existed because you shrunk away. And yes, you will lose. But don't be afraid. What you lose when you assert yourself never really belonged to you. And what is yours, what is true, remains. Because there is nothing more magnetic than someone who is whole. Not perfect, not unshakable, but whole. And being whole, as you are now beginning to understand, is accepting your own shadows. It is embracing your flaws without becoming a hostage. To them, it is saying, I'm afraid, but I'm going. I made a mistake, but I'm moving on. I still sabotage myself sometimes, but I don't abandon myself anymore. That is self-esteem. That is growth. And that is the beginning of your freedom. You spent your life trying to be someone else so that others would love you. And now you are beginning to realize that the love you lacked most was your own. Because no one can fill the void that your own absence has created. You were there, but not fully. You were present for others, but absent from yourself. You were available to meet the needs of others, but deaf to your own desires. And that is why your growth was compromised. Because growing up requires presence. It requires roots. And no one flourishes if they are constantly pulling themselves apart to fit in. You didn't grow up slowly because you were incapable. You grew up slowly because deep down, you didn't believe you could legitimately occupy this world. And I know it's not your fault. It's history. It's trauma. It's repetition. But now, knowing this, the responsibility is yours. And that's not punishment. That's freedom. Because when you understand that your pain has a source, it ceases to be destiny. And if it ceases to be destiny, it can be transformed. I want you to look at yourself with eyes that have never looked at you before. Eyes of acceptance, respect, hope. Because you no longer have to prove anything to anyone. Your existence alone justifies your right to grow. It doesn't matter if you were told you were too much, too sensitive, too intense, too ambitious. Those adjectives don't describe you. They describe the emotional limitations of those who uttered them. And you can no longer live according to the low emotional ceiling of others. Now it's time to build your own inner space. A place where mistakes are allowed, where desire is honored, where tiredness is heard. A place where your growth is no longer held back by guilt, but guided by awareness. Because growing up, my friend, is becoming aware of yourself, of your own patterns, of the mechanisms that imprison you. And consciousness is the only light capable of dissolving the darkness of repression. You already know that all self-sabotage is loyalty to the past, that every standstill is an attempt to preserve the bond with an old pain. But I invite you to a new pact, a pact with the life that wants to be born in you, with the power that dwells within you, even if it is dormant. You no longer need to negotiate your essence to be accepted. You no longer need to fragment yourself to belong. True freedom is belonging to yourself. And when that happens, something changes in your gaze. Anxiety gives way to confidence. Haste dissolves into consistency. And fear becomes a sign that you are on the right path. Because fear and desire go hand in hand. Where there is fear, there is also something very precious wanting to emerge. And now you know, your task is not to eliminate fear. It is to walk with it, like an old companion who warns you, but does not command you, who alerts you, but does not decide for you. You are ready. You may not feel ready, and that's okay. Because readiness in psychoanalysis is not the absence of pain. It is the willingness to look at it. It is being able to say, I don't know exactly how, but I want to go. And wanting is everything. Because desire is the engine of the psyche. It is what moves the inner world. It is what builds the external reality. Desire. Desire loudly. Desire for yourself. And when the voices come saying, who do you think you are? Respond calmly. I am the one who finally understood that I deserve it. Because in the end, everything you were looking for in others was a reflection of what already existed within you. You sought approval because you doubted your own worth. You sought recognition because you felt invisible to yourself. You sought love because you learned to reject yourself. But now, you are beginning to return, to recognize yourself, to reconnect with yourself. And in this return, something aligns. Your soul begins to breathe again. The speed of your growth increases, not because of pressure, but because the path is clear. The unconscious, once a saboteur, becomes an ally. And then, my friend, you become unstoppable. Not because you know. Longer feel fear, but because you have finally freed yourself from the shame of feeling. Not because you have become perfect, but because you no longer need to pretend. Your strength does not lie in how well you can hide your pain, but in how well you can live with it without losing yourself. That is psychic courage. That is emotional maturity. That is true self-esteem. And now I ask you, are you willing to live with this new level of responsibility? Because freedom comes at a price. It costs the comfort of victimhood. It costs the fantasy that someone will come to rescue you. But in return, you gain everything. You gain ownership of your life. You gain the ability to decide. You gain the right to make mistakes without falling apart. You gain the privilege of finally growing at the speed of your truth. This is your analysis. This is your path. And if you've made it this far, it's not for nothing. Something inside you already knew. You already felt it. You were already asking for this journey. Now you no longer walk blindly. You walk with awareness. And that changes everything. If this content touched something inside you, if a part of you finally felt understood, I invite you to share it. Not as someone spreading information, but as someone handing over a key. A key that may open other doors in other minds, in other souls. Because in the end, that's what we're doing here. Opening doors. And the most important, is already open inside you. May this awareness accompany you. If this video was a session for you, leave a comment. I free myself from the old me. Share this analysis with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to continue this journey of self-discovery with me, you know where to find me.